By 1968, the sprawling headquarters of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, in Saigon, had become a cathedral of high-stakes bookkeeping. Under the command of General William Westmoreland, the United States military had adopted a chillingly clinical metric for success: the body count. Because there were no fixed front lines in the shifting shadows of the jungle, Washington demanded a quantifiable way to prove they were winning. Success was no longer measured by territory gained, but by the sheer volume of enemy dead reported at the end of each day. To the big army machine, war was an attrition-based equation. If the kill ratio was high enough, the enemy would eventually reach a breaking point. This created a culture where every platoon was pressured to produce a tally. The numbers flowed upward from the humid rice paddies to the air-conditioned offices in Saigon, fueling a statistical obsession that equated corpses with progress. It was into this atmosphere of morbid accounting that a four-man patrol from the Australia SAS emerged from the dense, triple-canopy forest of the Iron Triangle. They had been outside the wire for 10 grueling days, operating in a sector crawling with North Vietnamese regulars. As the SAS patrol commander, a lean, mud-caked sergeant named Benning, walked into the debriefing tent, a young American liaison officer stood ready with a clipboard. The officer was accustomed to the briefings of U.S. units, which often began with an enthusiastic report of confirmed kills and captured weapons. "Welcome back, Sergeant," the American officer said, his pen poised. "Initial report on the contact? We heard some activity in your sector. What's your tally for the mission? How many VC did you neutralize?" Benning took a slow drink of bitter coffee, his eyes still adjusted to the green gloom of the bush. "0 kills, Lieutenant," he replied flatly. "No shots fired, no bodies to report." The American officer's pen froze. He looked at the SAS operator's tattered fatigues, the charcoal camouflage still smeared across his face, and the haunted exhaustion in his eyes. To the lieutenant, a 10-day mission into the heart of enemy territory that resulted in 0 kills was a failure, a waste of resources and time. 0, the lieutenant repeated, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of skepticism. "The scouts reported you were right on top of a major NVA supply hub. You spent 10 days in a hornet's nest and didn't take a single soul out?" Benning offered a tired, knowing smile. "We didn't take their lives, Lieutenant. We took their secrets. We found their hospital, mapped their bunkers, and identified the arrival time of their next shipment. We were ghosts. If we had killed anyone, they'd know we were there. Right now, they think they're alone, and that's why they're going to lose." This was the fundamental cultural clash. Why the SS didn't count kills was a concept that directly challenged the very foundation of the American war effort. While the Americans were looking for blood to satisfy a ledger, the Australia SS was looking for the leverage that would win a war. To the Americans, the mission had been a hollow zero. To the Australians, it was a masterclass in professional warfare. For the Australia SAS, the body count was not just a flawed metric. It was an antithesis to their core doctrine. Their operational philosophy was rooted in the concept of the ghost patrol. In the eyes of an SAS commander, the most successful mission was one where the team infiltrated the heart of darkness, observed the enemy's most intimate secrets, and extracted without the adversary ever realizing their perimeter had been breached. To the SAS, the jungle was a sanctuary of information. They understood that firing a weapon was often an admission of a failed reconnaissance. A single gunshot shattered the silent bubble they worked so hard to maintain. Once a shot was fired, the mission transformed from a strategic intelligence-gathering operation into a tactical survival struggle. The enemy would swarm, the sector would go on high alert, and the intel would dry up as the NVA moved their assets. "If you kill a sentry, you've told the NVA where you are," Sergeant Benning explained to the puzzled American liaison. "But if you sit 5 meters away and watch that sentry for 3 days, you know when he eats, when his relief arrives, and which trail lead to the commander's bunker. A corpse tells you nothing. A living enemy tells you everything." This ghost philosophy prioritized long-term strategic disruption over immediate tactical gratification. The Australians took pride in their hard target status, the ability to remain invisible while exerting maximum influence. While the Americans were confused by the lack of physical trophies, the SS was busy building a comprehensive human map of the battlefield. They believed that killing the enemy's ability to plan was far more lethal than killing a few individual soldiers. For the SAS, the true measure of a professional was the silence he left behind. The friction between the SAS and the American command eventually reached the briefing rooms of higher headquarters. For the American officers, whose promotions in unit evaluations often hinged on kill-to-casualty ratios, the Australian approach looked less like elite warfare and more like passive observation. This created a profound productivity crisis in the eyes of the U.S. military bureaucracy. "We are running a war of attrition, Sergeant," a colonel from MACV intelligence remarked during a particularly tense debriefing. "The North Vietnamese have a seemingly bottomless well of manpower. The only way we win is by draining that well faster than they can refill it. When your team goes out and comes back with zero, you aren't helping us reach that tipping point." The colonel's frustration was a symptom of a larger systemic issue. In the American managerial style of warfare, every patrol was an investment of flight hours, rations, and ammunition. If the return on that investment wasn't a confirmed body count, the accountants in Saigon viewed the mission as non-productive. They struggled to quantify the value of a report that described the mood of a village or the specific tire tread patterns of a truck convoy. The Australians, however, viewed productivity through a lens of information dominance. They argued that the American obsession with bodies was leading to a quantity over quality trap. "You want numbers, sir? I can give you numbers," Benning responded, leaning over a map of the long high hills. "Because we didn't engage that patrol on day 3, we were able to follow them to a hidden karst cave. In that cave, there are roughly 2,000 tons of rice in a radio relay station that coordinates every ambush in this province. If I had killed those 3 scouts to pad your ledger, we would still be looking for that cave." The SAS argued that the Americans were often killing the messengers while letting the message get through. To the Australians, a 10-man VC squad dead in a ditch was a minor inconvenience for the NVA. But a mapped supply route that allowed B-52s to incinerate a regimental headquarters? That was a strategic victory. The confusion in the American command stemmed from a refusal to accept that inaction could be an offensive tool. To the U.S. military, aggressive meant pulling the trigger. To the SAS, aggressive meant the cold, calculated patience required to wait for a high-value target, while lower-level targets walked right past their muzzles. This clash of cultures highlighted the gap between an army trying to win a fight and a regiment trying to dismantle an insurgency. As the war progressed, the American obsession with productivity began to manifest as a dangerous psychological burden known as the body count trap. Because the U.S. command structure rewarded units based on their tallies, a toxic incentive system took root. Young officers, desperate to prove their combat effectiveness, felt an immense pressure to produce. This often led to number inflation, or more tragically, to soldiers taking unnecessary risks just to confirm a kill. In the dense scrub of the Iron Triangle, this trap frequently turned lethal for the hunters. To a conventional U.S. unit, seeing a North Vietnamese soldier fall was only half the job. The rules of the tally required a physical confirmation. This meant soldiers often had to break cover and move into the kill zone to search for weapons or documents. A moment of extreme vulnerability. The NVA and Viet Cong, well aware of this American habit, began to use dead bodies as bait, rigging corpses with grenades or positioning snipers to wait for the inevitable tally takers. "You're trading a living soldier for a dead statistic," Sergeant Benning observed after watching a nearby U.S. platoon nearly get wiped out while trying to retrieve an enemy rifle for a report. The SAS viewed this practice with a mixture of horror and professional disdain. To the Australians, the moment a target hit the ground, he ceased to be a priority. The only thing that mattered was the active threat. They refused to linger over bodies to count stripes or scavenge for souvenirs. In the SASR doctrine, the forest was a fluid environment. The longer you stayed in one spot to play accountant, the higher the probability that the enemy would fix your position and destroy you. "We don't count because the math of the jungle is different," Benning explained to a frustrated U.S. captain. "If I kill a man at 50 meters, he stays dead whether I write it down or not. But if I spend 2 minutes checking his pockets to satisfy your colonel in Saigon, I'm giving his mates 2 minutes to flank me. My priority isn't your ledger, it's my men's lives and the next grid reference." This detachment from the tally allowed the S to maintain a level of cool-headedness that the Americans often lacked. While some U.S. units felt a frantic need to engage every target to get their numbers up, the SAS remained selective. They understood that the psychological toll of the body count trap was making the Americans noisy and predictable. By refusing to participate in the morbid census, the SAS stayed focused on the only number that truly mattered, the zero on their own casualty list. They were in Vietnam to dismantle an insurgency, not to win a math competition, and they weren't about to die for a decimal point. The SAS's refusal to participate in the body count was not merely a tactical preference. It was a psychological weapon. They prioritized professionalism over publicity, believing that the mystery of an invisible enemy was far more terrifying than the sight of a fallen comrade. In the brutal mental landscape of the Vietnam War, the Australians understood that a pile of bodies was a tragedy that the NVA could rationalize as martyrdom, but a series of unexplained disappearances and silent sabotages was a nightmare that bred paranoia. A body count is a headline, Sergeant Benning once remarked, but silence is a message. If the enemy finds 10 bodies, they know they were in a fight. If they find absolutely nothing, no footprints, no brass, but their radio is dead and their commander has vanished, they begin to think the forest itself is against them. This silent war was designed to erode the enemy's will from the inside out. While the Americans often broadcasted their presence through massive search and destroy operations that resulted in hundreds of kills but left the enemy's infrastructure intact, the SAS operated like a scalpel. They practiced a technique they called the hard target profile. By leaving no trace of their presence, they forced the North Vietnamese to dedicate thousands of troops to guarding their rear areas against an enemy they couldn't even prove existed. The Americans were confused because they viewed impact as something you could photograph for a press release. They wanted publicity, tangible proof of progress to show a skeptical public back home. The SAS, however, viewed impact as the quiet breakdown of enemy logistics. When an NVA unit stopped receiving food because their hidden caches were mysteriously empty, or when they couldn't coordinate an attack because their secure routes felt compromised, the SAS had won. "You're looking for the Big Bang," Benning told a young U.S. intelligence officer. "You want the dramatic firefight and the body count to prove you're winning. We want the NVA to be afraid of the dark. We want them to spend so much time looking over their shoulders that they forget to look forward. You can't put a price on fear, Lieutenant, and you certainly can't count it on a clipboard." For the SAS, every unrecorded kill was a victory for the ghost legend. By refusing to seek the spotlight of the body count, they maintained an aura of invincibility. They were the phantoms of the jungle, a force that didn't need to count its victims because its reputation did the killing for them. This commitment to silent professionalism ensured that while the Americans won the statistics, the Australians won the psychological ground, proving that in special operations, what you don't say is often louder than what you do. As the conflict dragged on, the cracks in the body count strategy began to show. While the official reports from Saigon were filled with astronomical numbers of enemy casualties, the reality on the ground was starkly different. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong continued to launch massive, coordinated offensives. The math simply wasn't adding up. It was during this period of disillusionment that elite American units, such as the Green Berets, Special Forces, and the Navy SEALs, began to look toward their Australian counterparts with a new sense of respect. These American special operators were the first to realize that the big Army metrics were failing the mission. They saw that by chasing tallies, they were sacrificing the very hearts and minds and strategic intelligence required to win an unconventional war. They began to adopt the Australian mantra, mission over medals. The shift was subtle but profound. Instead of patrolling to find a fight, these specialized American teams began to prioritize staying deep, lingering in enemy territory to map the infrastructure that the body counters had ignored. "We stopped asking the Aussies for their tally," an American Special Forces captain later recalled. "We started asking them for their patterns. We realized that a report on how the enemy moved their cattle was worth 10 dead scouts." The Australians taught us that the enemy isn't a collection of targets. They're a system. If you want to win, you break the system, not just the individuals. This recognition created a bridge between the two forces. The SAS began to share their methods for silent infiltration and long-term observation, LTO. American units started to push back against the pressure from Saigon to produce body counts, arguing that their presence as hidden observers provided a tactical advantage that no kill ratio could match. They learned that 0 kills could be the highest mark of a successful infiltration, signifying that the team was so professional they had bypassed the enemy's entire security apparatus to reach the high-value intelligence beyond. The Americans finally understood why the SAS didn't count kills. It was because the SAS was playing a different game entirely. While the conventional military was playing a game of attrition, the SAS was playing a game of strategic paralysis. By the late stages of the war, the most effective American reconnaissance teams had become Aussie-fied, valuing the silence of a successful mission over the noise of a publicized firefight. They realized that in the shadows of Vietnam, the man who brings back the most bodies is often the man who learned the least. If the Australia SAS wasn't counting bodies, what exactly were they measuring? To the accountants of the Vietnam War, the SAS seemed to be operating in a vacuum, but in reality their debriefings were dense with a different kind of data, what they called environmental intelligence. While the Americans were obsessed with the quantity of the enemy, the Australians were focused on the quality of the enemy's logistics and the integrity of their own patrol. The first and most vital metric for any SAS patrol was their own casualty rate. In the SASR, the ultimate sign of a professional unit was its ability to operate in the most clobbered, dangerous zones for years without losing a single man. To them, a mission that resulted in 10 enemy deaths but 1 SAS casualty was a tactical failure. They believed that their operators were too highly trained and too valuable to be traded for expendable enemy infantry. Their body count was always focused on the number 0. 0 men left behind, 0 gear lost, and 0 footprints discovered. The second metric was logistical disruption. During a debrief, an SAS commander wouldn't brag about a firefight. Instead, he would produce a detailed report on rice caches neutralized or weapon pits identified. The SAS understood that a Viet Cong soldier could be replaced in a week, but a 1,000-pound cache of salt or a hidden medical bunker took months to rebuild. They tracked atmospherics, the morale of the local population, the frequency of enemy radio traffic, and the physical health of the NVA regulars they observed through their optics. If they noticed the enemy was skinning more rats for food or using rusted ammunition, that was a score far more significant than a dead sentry. It proved the enemy system was failing. "I don't care if you shot 5 men," Sergeant Benning once told a trainee. "I care if you found where they get their water. You kill a man, he's gone. You poison his well or map his supply route, and you've crippled his entire company." Lastly, they measured strategic leverage. This was the most difficult concept for the American command to grasp. If an SAS team identified a major NVA divisional headquarters and called in a B-52 strike, they didn't claim those hundreds of kills for their own tally. To the SAS, that was a joint success. They were the eyes, the phantoms who enabled the massive weight of Allied air power to hit the right spot at the right time. For the Australia SAS, the true metric of success was the silence of a dismantled enemy, not the noise of a publicized victory. They left the counting to the politicians. They were too busy winning the war of shadows. The Vietnam War eventually drew to a close, leaving behind a complex trail of statistics that many historians now view as a cautionary tale. The American body count strategy is often cited as one of the greatest military miscalculations of the 20th century, a system that incentivized the wrong actions and provided a distorted view of a war that was being lost even as the kill ratios rose. In contrast, the Australia SAS emerged from the conflict with a reputation that has become the gold standard for modern special operations. The legacy of the SAS's refusal to count kills is the birth of the quiet professional archetype. This mindset transformed the way elite units across the globe, from the U.S. Delta Force to the British SAS, operate today. The modern special operator understands that his value is not found in the number of enemies he eliminates, but in the strategic outcomes he facilitates. The confusion that once reigned in the American command has been replaced by a deep, institutionalized respect for the Australian philosophy, effect over effort. This legacy is most visible in the way modern missions are evaluated. In the 21st century, special operations are judged by the delta of change, how much the operational environment has shifted due to the unit's presence. Did the insurgent network collapse? Did the supply lines dry up? Was the high-value target captured with minimal collateral noise? These are the metrics that the SAS pioneered in the jungles of Vietnam, long before the rest of the world caught up. Furthermore, the SAS mindset taught the global military community a vital lesson about human capital. By prioritizing the survival of their own highly trained men over padding the ledger with enemy dead, the SAS demonstrated that an elite unit's greatest strength is its institutional memory and collective experience. You cannot replace a 10-year veteran tracker with 1,000 reported kills on a clipboard. The SAS saved their men for the missions that actually mattered, ensuring they remained a lethal, sustainable force for the duration of the war and beyond. Today, the stories of the phantoms of the jungle serve as a reminder that in the world of shadows, silence is the ultimate currency. The Australia SAS didn't need to count their kills because they were focused on the only statistic that truly ends a war: the total dismantling of the enemy's will to fight. They left the counting to the historians and the glory to the loud, while they stayed in the shadows, proving that the most effective warriors are the ones you never see, never hear, and whose impact is felt long after they have vanished.